He left us nothing but debt. Claire said it clearly, the way you say something you've practiced until it sounds spontaneous. 30 years of work, and that's all he managed to leave us. Marcus nodded. He was sitting on her left, close enough that she could touch his arm, and he nodded the way a man nods when he wants the room to know he agrees, but has the decency to let someone else say it first. Helen Morris, 2 chairs down from the end of the table, went very still. James set his fork back on his plate without eating. I finished my drink. I set the glass down on the white tablecloth, where it left a faint ring. I watched for a second. Then I said, I need to make a phone call. What Claire didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already made 3. The table held 9 people that Thursday. Claire and Marcus sat at the far end, closest to the kitchen, where they'd arranged themselves the way they always did. Marcus with his back to the window, Claire on his left, close enough that she could touch his arm when she wanted him to stop talking or start. My son James sat across from me, a fork halfway to his mouth when Claire raised her glass. He set it back down without eating. Helen Morris, our neighbor from Clarkson Drive, was there too. She'd been coming to Thanksgiving since my wife Ruth passed, a standing invitation I'd renewed every October without discussion. Helen's husband Carl sat beside her, and Claire's 2 college friends completed the row on the far side. Everyone had heard. The dining room in that house wasn't built for secrets. Ruth had designed it that way on purpose. She'd told me once she wanted a room where conversations carried. I had arrived 11 minutes late. A water main break on Colfax had backed traffic to Federal, and I'd sat in my truck on the overpass watching the red lights stretch south toward downtown Denver. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the front lights were already on and I could see movement through the kitchen window. I came in through the side door, the one that opens into the hallway, just off the dining room, and I heard Claire's voice before I heard anything else. He's going to fight it, she was saying. That's the thing about Dad. He holds on. Marcus's voice, lower, he'll sign. He doesn't have a choice. What else is he going to do with a house he can't maintain on a fixed income? I just need him to understand this is practical. Claire said, it's not personal. I stood in the hallway a moment longer. The house they wanted was in Cherry Creek. I knew that because Claire had mentioned it twice in the past month, each time as though it were a casual observation. What I hadn't known, until I heard Marcus say the number through the wall, was the price, $1.2 million, $400,000 beyond what their income could carry. The collateral they had in mind was the house I was standing 40 feet from, the one Ruth and I had bought in 1991, the one worth $800,000 on today's market, the one still solely in my name. I stood in the hallway for a moment. The coat hooks were on my left. Ruth's blue wool coat still hung on the second one, where it had been for 4 years. I hadn't moved it. I took off my jacket, hung it on the third hook, and walked into the dining room. Nobody mentioned that I'd heard anything. I sat down at my end of the table, accepted the wine James poured without asking, and the meal began. The turkey was good. The rolls were from the bakery on 6th, the same ones Ruth used to order. I ate without hurrying. Claire waited until the plates were half cleared. Then she stood, lifted her glass, and looked at me directly across the length of the table. To Dad, she said, who built everything he had and left us nothing but debt. We're grateful for what he tried to do, and we're asking him tonight in front of the people who love this family to sign the loan papers so Marcus and I can finally have a real home. We can't do this without you, Dad. You know that. She kept her eyes on me the whole time. Marcus was nodding. Helen Morris had gone very still. James set down his wine glass with a small, careful sound. The room waited. I finished my drink. I set the glass down on the white tablecloth, where it left a faint ring. I watched for a second. Then I looked at Claire, really looked at her, the way I used to look at a property before signing anything, taking inventory of what was actually there versus what was being advertised. She was 34 years old. She had her mother's chin and her mother's habit of tilting her head slightly when she wanted something. She had learned, somewhere along the way, that making a request public made it harder to refuse. I need to make a phone call, I said. Excuse me. I walked out of the dining room. through the hallway, and out the side door. The November air in Denver was 28 degrees, and the sky was clear. I stood on the back step for a moment, looking at the yard, the fence I'd repaired in September, the garden beds Ruth had planted and I'd kept going, the detached garage where I still kept the drafting table from my 31 years managing commercial properties along the Front Range. Then I took out my phone. I didn't call anyone. I had already made the calls that mattered. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning, Patricia Chen had called me. Patricia had been the executor of Ruth's estate, a position Ruth had chosen carefully, the way she chose everything carefully. Patricia was 62, a real estate attorney who had worked Denver probate for over 2 decades, and she had known Ruth since the early years of our marriage when they'd served together on the board of a neighborhood land trust. When Patricia called, I was at my kitchen table with coffee and the morning paper, the same routine I'd kept since retiring. "Michael," she said without preamble, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you react." She had found an email thread. She didn't say how, and I didn't ask, because Patricia had always been careful about what she disclosed and why. The thread was between Claire and Marcus, dated 6 weeks earlier, and it laid out a plan in the kind of language that people use when they believe they're being practical. Claire needed a co-signer on a loan. The house she and Marcus wanted was in Cherry Creek, priced at $1.2 million, which was $400 beyond what their combined income could support without collateral. The collateral they had in mind was the property on Clarkson Drive, the house Ruth and I had bought in 1991, where we had raised both children, where Ruth had died in the back bedroom in March 4 years ago, and which I still owned outright. She wrote, Patricia said, reading from the thread, "He doesn't understand what he's sitting on. That house is worth $800,000 minimum and he's living in it alone. If he signs as co-signer, we use the equity. If he won't, we push until he does." I was quiet for a moment. Outside my kitchen window, the maple in the backyard had gone orange. It was the tree Ruth had planted from a sapling the year James was born. "Patricia," I said, "do you still have the codicil?" "I have everything Ruth left," she said. "I've had it since she signed it." "Good," I said. "Keep it ready, and bring it with you when I ask." Back on the step in the November cold, with the dining room light behind me and the yard dark ahead, I stood for a minute and a half, long enough that James would know I wasn't coming back immediately, long enough that Claire would start to wonder. Then I went back inside, sat down, and accepted a second pour of wine. The conversation had moved to other things. Marcus was telling Helen's husband about a development project near Stapleton. Claire was watching me. I ate the rest of my dinner. I thanked Helen for the pie she'd brought. I helped James carry the dishes to the kitchen, and when Claire touched my arm near the sink and said, quietly, "Dad, we should talk," I told her there was nothing to discuss tonight. "Tomorrow," I said, "come by the house." She searched my face for something. I don't know if she found it. I drove home on Colfax in the dark, the same road I'd driven for 31 years, and when I got inside, I sat at the kitchen table for a while without turning on the lights. The maple was a shape in the window. I thought about Ruth, about the codicil she'd had Patricia draw up 8 months before she died, about the conversation we'd had when she told me what was in it, and about what she'd said at the end of that conversation. "You'll know when," she had told me. I called Patricia at 9 o'clock. She picked up on the second ring. "Thanksgiving went the way you expected?" she asked. "More or less," I said. "I think we're close." "I'll have everything ready," she said. "Just tell me when and where." I told her I'd be in touch within the week. Then I said goodnight, hung up, and sat in the dark kitchen a little longer. The maple moved slightly in the wind. Somewhere on the street, a car passed. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they've held a life and are still holding the shape of it. The call from Claire came at 8:47 the next morning. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and the Denver Post. Though I hadn't read past the front page, I knew she would call. The only question had been when. "Dad." Her voice carried the particular softness she used when she wanted something, not the sharp edge from the night before, but the version I remembered from when she was 12 and had broken the back window of my truck and needed me not to be angry. I'm sorry about last night. The toast was, I shouldn't have said it that way. I let a moment pass before I answered. Silence has a weight to it, and I've learned to use that weight deliberately. All right, I said. It's just that we're really in a difficult position. The house we're in is too small, especially now that Marcus's mother is going to need somewhere to stay part of the year, and we hoped that maybe you'd be willing to help, to sign over some of the equity in the Millbrook property so we could qualify for a larger mortgage. She paused. You're not using that house. Dad, you're in the bungalow on Larimer. Millbrook just sits there. Millbrook did not just sit there. Millbrook was the house her mother and I had built in 1989, the house where Claire had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where James had broken his collarbone falling out of the elm tree we'd since had to cut down. It was the house where Diane had died in the back bedroom 11 years ago, with the afternoon light coming through the curtains she'd chosen herself at a store in Cherry Creek. Millbrook was not sitting anywhere. It was holding its ground exactly where we had put it. I'll call you back, I said. I did not call her back. The Denver Post sat on the table. I drank the rest of the coffee. Then I went to my desk in the back room, opened the second drawer, and checked the folder I'd started 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Everything was where I'd left it. I already made 3 calls that morning, the first to my bank, the second to a title company I'd worked with for 15 years, and the third to Patricia Chen's office to let her assistant know the timeline was moving forward. None of those calls were ones Claire or Marcus knew about. Marcus arrived at the bungalow the following afternoon, a Thursday. I heard his truck in the driveway, a new F-250 Silver with a crew cab he didn't need, and I watched from the front window as he came up the walk. He was wearing a fleece vest and carrying nothing, which told me he'd come to talk rather than to show me paperwork. Men who bring paperwork are at least honest about what they want. Men who come empty-handed are still deciding how to frame it. I opened the door before he knocked. Michael, he said my name the way people do when they're trying to establish that you're on equal footing. Not Mr. Hargrove. Michael, I know you're frustrated. I get it. But I want to be straight with you. Man to man. He put his hands in the vest pockets. You've got assets you're not using. Claire is your daughter. The Millbrook property alone is worth what, 2.4? 2.6 on today's market. You're sitting on that. And meanwhile, we're in a house with 1,400 square feet, and my mother-in-law's situation is becoming a real logistical problem. I said nothing. Marcus took that as an invitation to continue. People always do. I'm not asking you to give it away. We'd refinance. You'd be compensated. Everyone moves forward. But we need you to work with us here, because the way things are going. He paused, shifting his weight slightly, and I noticed he didn't finish that sentence. The way things are going was a threat with the end bitten off. He was testing to see if I'd flinch. I looked at him for a moment. Then I stepped back and closed the door. Not hard, not with any particular emphasis. I simply closed it, and I heard him stand on the porch for a few seconds before his boots crossed the boards and went back down the steps. James called that evening. He was in Boulder, where he worked as a structural engineer for a firm that did commercial retrofits, and his voice on the phone was the same as it had been since he was a teenager, direct, slightly impatient with anything he considered unnecessary. He had always been that way. Diane used to say James came out of the womb ready for the agenda. Claire called me. He said, she told me you're thinking it over. The Millbrook thing. He said it the way you say something you don't believe. Dad, please tell me that's not actually true. What did she say exactly? She said you'd had a good conversation and you were considering your options. She said Marcus had gone over and you two had talked it through. A pause. Did you two talk it through? He came over. I said, I closed the door. James was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the impatience was gone. Okay. Good. Then, how bad was it at Thanksgiving I heard the toast? You weren't there. No, Gina's family. But Rachel texted me the whole thing as it was happening. Rachel was his cousin, Diane's sister's daughter, who had been seated 2 chairs down from Claire. She said Claire stood up and said you'd left the family nothing but debt. In front of everyone. In front of Aunt Louise. He stopped. Dad, I'm sorry. I should have been there. You had somewhere to be, I said. That's not— He stopped himself. I've been saying for 2 years that Marcus is using her. I told Claire directly, twice. She told me I was jealous of what they had, which is— I don't know what that means. But okay. His voice tightened slightly. You're not going to sign anything. Right. Tell me you're not going to sign anything. Do you know what I'm doing? I asked him. A brief pause. No, he said, but I trust you. That was the right answer. Not because I needed his trust to proceed. I'd already made 3 calls and the machinery was in motion whether James knew about it or not. But because it told me something I'd been quietly wondering about for several months, whether my son understood the difference between a man who is quiet because he has nothing left and a man who is quiet because he is finished preparing. James understood. That mattered. I'll keep you informed when it's time, I said. Until then, don't tell Claire we spoke. Obviously, he said. After I hung up, I sat in the back room for a while. The folder in the second drawer had a new page in it, now notes from the morning's calls, a confirmation number from the title company, and a date I'd written in the upper right corner 3 weeks ago and circled once. The date was still 2 weeks away. There was time. Not much, but enough. The maple outside the kitchen window had lost most of its leaves by then. The branches were bare against the November sky, and in the early dark they looked like lines on a survey map, precise, unambiguous, showing exactly what was there. 3 days after James left, Claire came back. She didn't call first. Her car, the silver SUV Marcus had leased the previous spring, pulled into the driveway at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. I was at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the property tax statements from the previous quarter, which I'd been sorting into 2 stacks, the ones that required action and the ones that were simply records. I heard the car door, then the rear door, then small voices. Emma was 7, Leo was 4. They came up the porch steps ahead of their mother, Emma holding Leo's hand on the last step, which she'd been doing since he learned to walk. I watched them through the window for a moment before I opened the door. Grandpa, Emma said it the way children say things they've rehearsed clearly, with the particular brightness of a word they've been told to use. Come in, I said. Both of you. Leo went straight for the wooden box of building blocks I kept on the bottom shelf of the bookcase in the living room. He'd been doing that since he was 2. Emma followed him, then sat down beside him on the rug and began sorting the blocks by color without being asked, which was something her grandmother used to do. Claire came in last. She was wearing a coat I hadn't seen before, dark wool, good quality. She kissed my cheek and said the house smelled like coffee, which it did. I made enough for 2, I said. We sat at the kitchen table. Through the doorway, I could see Leo arranging blocks in a row on the rug and Emma correcting his spacing with 2 fingers, very gently. Claire watched them for a moment, then looked back at me. She started with the neighborhood. She'd been reading about the Stapleton redevelopment, the new mixed-use corridor going in near the old airport land. Property values in the adjacent zip codes had risen 14% in 18 months. She had the numbers. She'd printed them from a real estate website and folded the pages into her coat pocket, and she put them on the table between us without unfolding them, as if the fact of their existence was the point. You know all this already, she said. I do, I said. Then you know what the house is worth right now, what it could be worth in 2 years if you hold it, she paused, or what you could do with the equity if you moved somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage. I looked at my coffee. The surface was still, the way it gets when the cup has been sitting long enough. Claire, I said, what is it you're actually asking? She folded her hands on the table. She'd learned that from her mother, the folded hands, the deliberate stillness before a difficult sentence. Marcus and I have been looking at a property on Dexter. 4 bedrooms, good school district. The lot backs up to a green belt. I know the street, I said. We're short on the down payment, not by much, but the bank wants 22%, and we're at 16. She looked at the pages she hadn't unfolded. If you were to liquidate the equity on this house, even a portion of it, we could close by February. The kids would have a yard. From the living room, Leo made a small sound of satisfaction. He'd finished his row of blocks. Emma was already building something beside it taller, more complicated. I looked at my daughter. She was 34 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of holding her shoulders when she was waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted. She was also, I had come to understand over the past several months, capable of a particular kind of selective memory, the kind that allows a person to believe they are asking for something reasonable when they have already decided the answer is owed to them. "The kids will live wherever you and Marcus decide," I said. "That's your job, not mine. What I want for Emma and Leo has nothing to do with square footage." She looked up. "What I want," I said, "is for them to be loved well. You're their mother. You know how to do that. You don't need my equity to do it." Claire's jaw tightened. Not much, just a small shift, the kind you notice only if you've been watching someone's face for 34 years. She picked up the folded pages and put them back in her pocket. "You make everything so much harder than it needs to be," she said. Her voice was quiet, controlled. She was keeping it controlled because the children were in the next room. "Maybe," I said. She called the kids. Emma came immediately. Leo brought 2 blocks with him, 1 in each hand, and kept them when he put his coat on. Claire buckled his car seat from the driveway, and I stood on the porch and watched. Before she got in the driver's side, she looked back at me once. I lifted a hand. She didn't. The silver SUV backed out of the driveway and turned toward Colorado Boulevard. I went inside, washed the 2 coffee cups, and picked up the phone. Patricia Chen had been the estate attorney for my wife's family for 26 years before Ruth died, and she'd handled Ruth's estate afterward with the particular care of someone who understood that documents are only one part of what gets passed down. She was 62, precise in her language, and she had a way of pausing before she answered a question that I had always found reassuring. It meant she was answering the question you actually asked, not the one she assumed you meant. "I've been expecting your call," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm ready to move forward. I need to review Ruth's documents in full. The will, the codicil, everything." A brief pause. "I can have copies to you by end of week. Or you can come to the office. I'd recommend the office." "Thursday," I said. "Thursday at 2, she said. "Michael, are you certain about the timing?" I looked out the kitchen window. The maple branches were still bare, the same precise lines against the same November sky. "The timing has been set for 3 weeks, I said. "I'm catching up to it, not choosing it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll have everything ready." I drove to Patricia's office on Thursday. It was on the 16th floor of a building on 17th Street that I'd walked past 100 times during my years managing commercial properties in the downtown corridor. The receptionist, a young man named Daniel, who introduced himself with a handshake, brought me water without being asked and showed me to the conference room where Patricia was already seated at the far end of the table, a large manila envelope and 2 bound folders in front of her. She stood when I came in. We shook hands. She waited until Daniel had closed the door before she sat back down. "The will is straightforward," she said, opening the first folder. "Ruth was precise. The house at Gilpin Street, the investment accounts, and the mineral rights on the Larimer County property, all designated to you outright. No conditions, no time constraints. Claire and James each receive a specific bequest." She turned a page. "A cash amount, listed here, equal amounts. Ruth wanted that clarity." I looked at the numbers. They were not small. They were also not the house. "And the codicil," I said. Patricia opened the second folder. The document inside was 4 pages, printed on the same heavy stock as the original will, notarized on the final page with a stamp I recognized from Ruth's attorney's office in Cherry Creek. Ruth had signed it in the spring of 2019, 8 months before she died. Her signature was the same as it had always been, the capital R with its particular backward lean, the H that dropped below the line. "Ruth added this without telling either child," Patricia said. "She told me at the time that she hoped it would never need to be used, but she wanted it in place." I read it through once, then again. The language was clear. If any heir or beneficiary were to apply financial pressure, undue influence, or coercive conduct toward Michael Aldrin Calloway with respect to any asset in which he held sole title or beneficial interest, that heir would forfeit the specific bequest designated to them in the original will. The forfeiture would be determined by the executor upon review of credible evidence of such conduct. Patricia Chen was named executor. Ruth had written a handwritten note at the bottom of the final page. Above her signature, it was 3 sentences. I had not seen it before. I read it twice and did not read it a third time. She knew, I said. She suspected, Patricia said carefully. She loved Claire. She also knew her daughter. She wanted you protected. I set the document down. Outside the conference room window, the downtown skyline was flat and gray under the November overcast. Somewhere below, on the street, a delivery truck was backing up, and its warning tone came up faint through the glass, steady, rhythmic, impossible to ignore. "What do you need from me to proceed?" I said. Patricia folded her hands on the table. "A written account of the conduct you've observed. Dates, specific statements, specific requests. I've already begun a file based on what you told me in October, but the more specific your account, the cleaner the determination." "I have notes," I said. "I've been keeping them since August." She looked at me steadily. "Then we're in good shape." I opened the folder I'd brought with me, the one from the second drawer, the one with the confirmation number from the title company, and the date I'd circled 3 weeks ago. I slid it across the table. Patricia took it without comment, put on her reading glasses, and began to read from the first page. She read for 6 minutes without speaking. I drank the water Daniel had brought. The delivery truck outside finished its cycle, and the warning tone stopped. When she reached the last page, she removed her glasses and set them on the table beside the folder. She looked at me the way she had at Ruth's estate review 4 years ago, not with sympathy, exactly, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has seen many things clearly and is not surprised by what clarity costs. "This is sufficient," she said. "More than sufficient." "Good," I said. "The date you've circled," she said. 2 weeks from now." "Yes." "That's the family dinner." "Yes." She picked up her glasses again and put them back on, then closed both folders and aligned them squarely with the edge of the table. "I'll be there," she said. "You won't need to say anything to Claire beforehand." "I know," I said. "That's the point." I signed the authorization form Daniel brought in at 3 o'clock. Patricia walked me to the elevator herself, which she didn't usually do. At the elevator door, she said, "Ruth would have approved of how you've handled this." I pressed the button. The doors opened. "She planned most of it," I said. I drove back on Colfax, the long way, past the stretch of older apartment buildings and the hardware store that had been there since before Claire was born. The street was ordinary and familiar, the way streets get when you've driven them long enough that you stop seeing them and start feeling them, the particular rhythm of the lights, the dip before the railroad crossing, the way the mountains appear for 3 blocks between the buildings before the angle closes them off again. The folder was on the passenger seat. The envelope Patricia had given me, sealed, with my name written in her handwriting on the front, was tucked inside it. She had told me not to open it until the dinner. I hadn't planned to. James's birthday dinner was at Carmine's, a restaurant on East Colfax that had been there since 1987, the same year my wife and I closed on the house on Larimer. We'd had James's 5th birthday there, and his 15th, and the dinner after his college graduation. The owner, a man named Sal Petricelli, had seated us at the same corner table for 31 years, out of habit or sentiment, or both. When I arrived at 7, James was already there, standing near the host stand in the jacket he'd worn to his mother's funeral. He hugged me and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. Marcus and Claire arrived 11 minutes later. I know because I had been watching the door. Marcus was wearing a sport coat I hadn't seen before, charcoal, expensive looking, and he held the door for Claire with the particular deliberateness of a man who wants to be seen holding a door. Claire had her hair up. She looked tired beneath the effort of not looking tired. She kissed James on the cheek and then came to me and kissed mine, and her perfume was the same one her mother had worn for the last 6 years of her life. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it. We ordered. Sal came by the table himself and shook my hand and asked about the Larimer property, which I told him was moving along. Marcus ordered the most expensive thing on the menu without looking at the price, which was a habit I'd observed across many dinners and had stopped registering as anything but information. The bread came. James talked about a project at work, something involving a mixed-use development in the Highlands neighborhood, a block and a half from where his grandmother had lived. Claire asked 2 questions and then looked at her phone. Marcus poured himself a second glass of wine before the entrees arrived. The folder was in my jacket pocket, folded once. The envelope was inside the folder. Marcus set his glass down and looked at me across the table. He had the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was deciding whether to use it. "So," he said, "have you had a chance to think about the paperwork?" The table went quiet. James looked at his water glass. Claire looked at Marcus, then at me. A couple at the next table continued their conversation, unaware that the temperature at ours had dropped several degrees. The paperwork, that was what he called it. Not the loan, not the transfer, not what it actually was, a request that I use my wife's house as collateral for a mortgage I hadn't agreed to and wouldn't benefit from. The paperwork. I looked at Marcus for a moment. Then I picked up my napkin, set it beside my plate, and stood up. "I want to say something clearly," I said, "in front of everyone here." Claire's expression shifted. James went very still. "I will not sign any paperwork," I said. "Not now, not in a week, not after another dinner where the question gets asked more pleasantly. Your mother," I looked at Claire, "left what she left to protect me. Not to be redistributed because someone wants a house they haven't earned. I won't do it." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Marcus recovered first. He smiled, not the real smile, the other one. "Nobody's asking you to give anything away. Michael, this is family helping family. That's how it works." "That's not how it works," I said. I sat back down. Family doesn't leverage one member to fund another's ambitions. If you can't qualify for a mortgage on your own income, on your own credit, then you're not ready to buy that house. That's not a judgment. That's arithmetic. Helen Morris was seated 2 tables away. I had known this when I chose the restaurant. She had been a client of mine for 11 years. First as a buyer, then as an agent I referred work to regularly, and she had arrived at 7:15 for a dinner of her own. She was not part of what was happening at our table, but she was present for it. When Marcus finished speaking, I saw her set down her fork. "Michael," Marcus said, and there was an edge under the pleasantness now. "You're being unreasonable." "I'm being clear," I said. "There's a difference." Claire put her hand flat on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and careful in the way that means the opposite of calm. "You don't love me," she said. "If you loved me, you wouldn't do this." I looked at her. She was 34 years old, and she was sitting across from me in the same restaurant where we had celebrated every significant thing in her life since she was 5. And she was telling me that love was a transaction that required my signature. "I love you," I said. "I have loved you since before you could speak. But I will not destroy what your mother built to fund a lifestyle that neither of you has come close to earning. That's not love failing. That's love holding." Claire's eyes filled. Marcus put his hand on her arm, and I noticed that the gesture was directed at me, performed for me rather than offered to her. "You always do this," Claire said. "You always make it about principles." "Your mother made it about principles," I said. "I'm just honoring what she decided." James hadn't spoken since the bread. He looked up now and said quietly, "Can we eat?" Nobody answered him for a moment. Then I picked up my fork. The entrees had arrived at some point during the conversation and were sitting in front of us. Cooling. I cut into the salmon. Sal Petricelli, who had been standing near the service station with the particular stillness of a man who has learned not to intervene in other people's dinners, turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Helen Morris, 2 tables over, resumed her own meal. She did not look at our table again, but she had heard everything. I knew that because I had counted on it. Marcus ate in silence. Claire moved food around her plate and didn't eat. James talked about the Highlands project, again picking up the thread from earlier as if it were a rope someone had dropped, and I asked him questions about the zoning variance and the parking structure and the timeline for the ground floor retail. He answered carefully and at length, and his voice was steady, and I was grateful for him in the specific way. You become grateful for a person when they do the quiet, difficult thing without being asked. The check came. I paid it. Marcus said nothing when I did, which was different from his usual protest, and I noted that too. Outside, on the sidewalk, the night was cold in the way Denver gets in late November, dry and sharp, the mountains invisible now behind the dark, but present the way they always are, even when you can't see them. Claire hugged James and then stood near the valet stand without looking at me. Marcus shook James's hand and said something to him in a low voice that James didn't respond to. I walked to my car. I did not look back at them. The folder was still in my jacket pocket. The envelope inside it was still sealed. Patricia had told me not to open it until the dinner, and I hadn't, and I still wouldn't not tonight. Tonight had done what it needed to do. The drive home was the same route I'd taken for 34 years. And the mountains came through between the buildings for 3 blocks before the angle took them away again, and I drove the rest of the way in the particular silence that comes after you've said exactly what you meant to say, in front of exactly the right people, and there is nothing left to add. 3 days after the dinner, Patricia Chen called at 8:14 in the morning. I was standing at the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, watching the light work its way across the back fence. The number on the screen was her direct line. I'd had it in my phone since October, when I'd first called her after the conversation with James. I picked up before the third ring. She said, "Michael, I think it's time." Those 4 words were enough. We'd spoken twice in the weeks before Thanksgiving, once when I reached out to her, once when she called to confirm she'd reviewed everything in the file. Both times she'd been precise and unhurried. The way people are when they've been doing a particular kind of work for a long time and have stopped needing to perform urgency. She had been managing estates in Denver for 23 years. She'd handled my wife's initial paperwork in 2017, and she'd been the one Sandra had called in 2019 when Sandra decided to make changes. Patricia had known about the codicil for 4 years. She'd been waiting, as I had, for the right moment to use it properly. The office on Larimer, I said, 10 o'clock Thursday. Bring the envelope. I told her I still hadn't opened it. There was a brief pause. Good, she said. We'll open it together. Thursday was 2 days away. I put the phone down and finished my coffee, standing at the same window, watching a crow land on the fence post, and then think better of it and leave. The folder with the sealed envelope was on the kitchen table where I'd placed it the night I got home from the dinner. I hadn't moved it. I'd eaten breakfast at the counter for 2 days to avoid sitting near it. Not because I was afraid of what was inside. I already knew the substance of it. Patricia had described the document to me in general terms during our first call, enough for me to understand what Sandra had done and why. What I hadn't done was read my wife's actual words. That was something different, and I'd wanted to wait until I was in the right room, with the right witness, at the right time. Sandra had always understood timing better than I did. On Thursday morning, I drove downtown and parked in the structure on 15th Street that I'd been using since 1998, when the firm I managed had its main office 2 blocks north. The city had changed around that parking structure considerably, but the structure itself was the same, and the attendant in the booth, a man named Gerald, who had been there for at least 11 years, gave me the same nod he always did and handed me the ticket without a word. Patricia's office was on the 4th floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous life and still had the high ceilings and marble floors to prove it. Her assistant, a young woman named Diane, showed me in at exactly 10 o'clock. Patricia was already at the conference table with a legal pad, a pen, and a folder of her own. She stood when I came in and shook my hand the way she always did, firmly, briefly, like a handshake should be. She was 62, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the particular stillness of someone who had sat across from grieving families and contentious heirs for 2 decades and had learned that the room would always tell you when to speak. I set the envelope on the table between us. She looked at it for a moment, then at me. Ready. I said I was. She opened it herself with a letter opener she produced from her jacket pocket, and she did it carefully, the way you open something that matters. She removed the document inside and placed it flat on the table, and she slid it toward me so that we could both read it. It was 6 pages. The first 2 were the original will, dated March 2017, which I had seen before. The next 4 were the codicil, the amendment Sandra had added in September 2019. Patricia had described it to me in general terms, but reading my wife's actual language was something else entirely. Sandra had written it in plain terms, the way she wrote everything. The house on Crestview Lane, the property we had bought together in 1991, the one we had spent the better part of a decade renovating, the one where both children had grown up and where Sandra had died in the back bedroom on a Tuesday morning in April, was to remain solely in my name, not jointly held, not subject to any claim by either of our children without my explicit written consent, notarized and witnessed. The language was specific and had clearly been reviewed by counsel. Then came the paragraph that Sandra had written herself, in her own words, which Patricia had told me about but which I had not yet read. I am making this amendment because I love my daughter and I am afraid for my husband. Claire has always needed more than she let on, and Marcus has always wanted more than he deserved. I do not write this in anger. I write it because I have watched my husband work for 40 years to build something, and I will not allow it to be taken from him by people who mistake love for leverage. If any of our children attempt to use financial pressure, legal action, or sustained manipulation to compel Michael to transfer, encumber, or relinquish any portion of his estate, that child's share of the remaining estate, currently valued at $140,000 in accounts and personal property, shall be forfeited entirely and redistributed equally to any other surviving children and to the charitable remainder trust already named in the original document. I read that paragraph twice. Patricia sat quietly while I did. The room smelled like old paper and whatever cleaning product the building used on the marble floors. Outside, somewhere on Larimer Street, a delivery truck was idling. I was aware of all of this in the particular way you become aware of small things when something large is settling into place. She had this drafted in September 2019. Patricia said, when I looked up, she called me herself. She said she'd been thinking about it for some time and had decided she needed to act. She didn't want to tell you because she didn't want you to feel like she was managing the situation over your head. Patricia paused. She said you would handle it yourself when the time came, and that she wanted to make sure you had the tools to do it properly. I folded my hands on the table. Outside, the truck's idling stopped. She also said, Patricia continued, picking her words carefully, that she hoped you'd never need to use it. I told her I'd hoped that too. Patricia slid a second document across the table, a certified copy of the codicil, already prepared for filing. She explained that the original had been held in the estate file since 2019 and that she had been waiting for a triggering event, as specified in the codicil's own language, before taking any formal action. What had happened at the dinner 3 days ago, documented by James's written account, which Patricia had received that morning, met the threshold the document described. Sustained manipulation and financial pressure, she said, reading from her legal pad. That's the language. What happened at that table meets the standard. She told me she would file the certified copy with the county recorder's office that afternoon. Once filed, it would be a matter of public record. Any title search on the Crestview property, which any lender would conduct before approving a loan secured against it, would surface the codicil and the forfeiture clause within 48 hours. I asked if she needed anything from me. She said she needed my signature on 2 forms, one confirming my identity as the named beneficiary and one authorizing the filing. I signed both. Diane witnessed them. Patricia dated the copies and placed them in her folder with the precision of someone who had done this particular sequence of actions many hundreds of times. We shook hands again at the door. She said, Sandra was a careful woman. I said. She was the most careful person I ever knew. Patricia's assistant Diane had barely closed the conference room door behind Claire when my phone rang. The number on the screen was a Denver area code I didn't recognize. I was still at the conference table. Patricia was still across from me, her folder closed, her pen parallel to its edge. I answered. A man's voice, professional and unhurried, said, "Mr. Sinclair, this is David Reyes at Frontier Lending. I'm calling about a mortgage application that listed your property at Crestview Lane as potential collateral. The applicants are listed as Marcus and Claire Aldridge." I said, "I'm aware of the application." There was a brief pause. "Sir, I want to be straightforward with you. We received this application 10 days ago, and our underwriting team has completed its review. I'm calling because your name was listed as a prospective cosigner, and we were unable to reach you through the contact information provided." Another pause. "Mr. Sinclair, we're declining the application." I said, "Can you tell me why?" "Several reasons, all of which I can document in writing if needed. First, there is no co-signature from you. The application indicated your participation, but we have no signed consent. Second, our title search on the Crestview property shows sole ownership in your name, with no joint interest that would allow the applicants to use it as collateral without your explicit written authorization. Third," he paused, and I could hear him reading from something, "the applicant's combined debt-to-income ratio exceeds our threshold by a significant margin. Total documented debt is approximately $180,000 against a combined annual income of $150,000. We cannot approve a loan of the size requested under those conditions." I said, "I appreciate you calling me directly." "Of course, sir. I want to be clear, your name was used in a way that suggested your involvement in this application. If you have concerns about that, I'd recommend speaking with your own counsel." I told him I already had counsel. I thanked him and ended the call. The elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby. I walked through it, nodded to the security guard at the desk, a man named Phil, who had been in that lobby for as long as I'd been parking in the structure on 15th, and pushed through the glass doors onto Larimer Street. The December air was cold and clear in the way Denver gets in early winter, when the mountains are sharp on the horizon and the light has that particular flat quality that makes everything look more permanent than it is. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked west, where the peaks were visible above the downtown roofline, and I thought about Sandra sitting in this same city in September 2019, picking up the phone, calling Patricia Chen, and saying, "I want to make sure he has the tools to do it properly." She had known, not the specifics, not the dinner, not the toast, not Marcus's voice explaining to a room full of family that I'd left nothing but debt. She couldn't have known those specifics, but she had known the shape of it, the way you know the shape of weather before it arrives, and she had done what she always did. She had prepared. The codicil was filed by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Patricia texted me a confirmation at 3:07. The message said, "Done. It's on record. Call me if anything else comes up." But filing it was not the same as delivering it. Patricia had understood that from the beginning. 2 days after the filing, she called me at 8 in the morning and said, "I think they should hear it in person, from me, in this office, with you present. That's the cleanest way to do it." I said I agreed. She called Claire and Marcus separately and told each of them that there was a matter related to Ruth's estate requiring their attention, a routine review. She said, "Nothing alarming." She used the word routine deliberately. I know because she told me she had. They arrived together at 10 on a Friday morning. I was already in the conference room when they came in. Claire saw me first. Her expression shifted, not alarm, not yet. Just the particular recalibration of someone who expected one thing and found another. Marcus saw me a half-second later and kept his face neutral the way men do when they've decided in advance not to show anything. Patricia came in behind them and closed the door. She didn't offer coffee. She sat down, opened the folder in front of her, and said, without any preliminary, "Thank you both for coming. I need to walk you through an amendment to Ruth Calloway's estate that was executed in September of 2019 and has been held in this office since that date." Marcus said, "An amendment." "A codicil," Patricia said. "Legally binding, properly witnessed and notarized. I'll read the relevant section." She read it. She read it the way she did everything precisely, without editorial, at a pace that made it impossible to interrupt. She read the paragraph about financial pressure and undue influence. She read the forfeiture clause. She read the dollar amount, $140,000, redirected. The room was quiet when she finished. Marcus said, "That's not enforceable." Patricia looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses. She did not raise her voice. "It has been reviewed by 2 independent estate attorneys, filed with the county recorder's office, and is now a matter of public record. Any title search on the Crestview property will surface it within 48 hours. She paused. "It is entirely enforceable." "We didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has said a thing so many times he has stopped hearing how it sounds. "We asked for help. That's what families do." I said, "You told a room full of people that I'd spent 30 years leaving nothing but debt. You came to my door and told me I was sitting on assets I wasn't using. You filed a loan application that listed my property as collateral without my consent." I looked at him steadily. "That's not asking for help. That's applying pressure and calling it love." Marcus stood up. The chair went back hard against the wall behind him, not thrown, but fast, the way a chair moves when a man is trying to leave before his face gives him away. He looked at Claire. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the folder on the table, at the document inside it, at her mother's signature on the last page. Patricia said calmly, "Mr. Aldridge, you're welcome to consult your own counsel. The filing stands regardless." Marcus left the room. The door didn't slam. He controlled that much, but the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor in the hallway was loud and fast, and then gone. Claire stayed. She sat in her chair with her hands in her lap and looked at her mother's signature for a long time. Patricia and I waited. Diane, Patricia's assistant, appeared briefly in the doorway, and Patricia shook her head slightly, and Diane withdrew. Finally, Claire said very quietly, "She knew." "She suspected," I said. "She loved you. She also knew you." Claire's eyes filled. She didn't say anything else. After a moment, she stood, picked up her coat from the back of the chair, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at me. Not at Patricia, at me. And the look on her face was something I hadn't seen since she was very young, before she'd learned to want things strategically. It was just her face, without any of the architecture she'd built on top of it. She left without speaking. Patricia closed the folder and set her pen down parallel to its edge. She looked at me the way she had at Ruth's estate review years ago, not with sympathy, exactly, but with the steadiness of someone who has seen many things clearly and is not surprised by what clarity costs. "That's done," she said. "Yes," I said. Diane brought water neither of us had asked for. I drank mine. Outside the conference room window, the December sky was flat and gray, and somewhere below, on Larimer Street, a delivery truck was idling, its engine steady and unhurried, indifferent to everything that had just happened on the 4th floor. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the text arrived. The folder was still in front of me, but the envelope was empty now, the document inside it replaced by the certified copies Patricia had prepared. I set the phone down and looked at the empty envelope for a moment, and then I thought about the fact that my wife had written those words, "I will not allow it to be taken from him," in a room I'd never seen, in a conversation I hadn't known about, out of a love that had been working on my behalf for years before I'd had any reason to call it into service. The coffee in my cup was cold. I drank it anyway. The phone rang at 9:14 on a Sunday morning, 11 days after the meeting at Patricia's office. I was in the kitchen, reading the property section of the Denver Post, the way I'd done every Sunday for 30 years, not because I was looking to buy or sell anything, but because the habit had outlasted the career and I'd never seen a good reason to break it. Claire's name came up on the screen. I set the newspaper down and answered. She was crying before she said my name. Not the sharp, frustrated crying I'd heard from her in the weeks before Thanksgiving, the kind that came with demands attached. This was something slower. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known about the codicil, hadn't known her mother had written it, hadn't understood what she'd been doing to me. The words came out in pieces, the way words do when someone has been rehearsing them for a long time and still can't get them to sit right. I listened to all of it. There was a cardinal on the fence post outside the kitchen window, the same fence post where my wife used to hang the sweet feeder every November. The bird stayed for most of the call. When Claire finished, I said, "Sweetheart, I know you didn't know about the codicil." That was true. Patricia had confirmed as much. The document had been prepared privately, filed without announcement, and never discussed with the children. My wife had made that choice deliberately. She'd understood something about the situation that I hadn't fully understood until I read her words on the page. "But you should have known," I said. "That's the part that matters. Your mother worried about this for a reason. She saw something, and she was right to see it. We need time before anything else." Claire started to say something more. I told her I loved her, because I did, and I hung up. The cardinal was still on the fence post. I watched it for a moment, then folded the newspaper and put it on the stack by the back door. Marcus called that same afternoon. There was no crying in his voice. He said I had destroyed them. He said they had needed that house, that I had no idea what I'd done to their financial situation, that the meeting at Patricia's office had been a setup from the beginning, and he intended to talk to his own attorney about it. He said the words quickly, the way a man talks when he's been sitting with his anger for days and has finally decided to let it out. I waited until he'd finished. "You didn't need the house," I said. "You wanted it. There's a difference." He started again. I said, "Marcus, I'm going to hang up now," and I did. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after looking at the counter where my wife used to keep her recipe box, the green metal one with the rooster on the lid that she'd had since before we were married. The box was still there. I'd never moved it. I opened it once a few months after she died, found her handwriting on 3 dozen index cards, and closed it again. Some things you don't need to disturb. I poured a second cup of coffee and went back to the newspaper. Helen Morris called on a Tuesday. About a week later, she'd sold 2 properties for me over the years and had been the agent I'd called when I first started thinking about the Elmwood house, the early conversations. Before Thanksgiving, before any of it had become what it became, she had a directness I respected. She didn't waste time when she had something to say. "Michael," she said, "I'm hearing through the grapevine that Marcus and Claire are listing their condo, the Highlands unit." She paused. "Word is they're carrying more debt than the sale is going to cover." Denver's real estate community had always been smaller than it looked. Information moved the way it moved, and Helen had been in it for 25 years. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. There was a brief silence on the line. Helen said, "You doing all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "I appreciate the call." She said to reach out if I needed anything. I told her I would, and set the phone on the counter. The Highlands condo had been purchased 4 years ago, partly with money from a loan Marcus had taken against his own business, and partly with a down payment that I knew, because Claire had told me at the time, in a moment of transparency, she probably later regretted had come from an early draw on what she'd expected to receive from my wife's estate. They had been living 4 years on the assumption of an inheritance that the codicil had redirected. That was the architecture of the problem. It wasn't greed in the simple sense, the kind you could point at and name cleanly. It was something more complicated, a life built on a foundation that had never actually been theirs to build on. My wife had seen it. She'd seen it, and she'd done what she could, in the only way available to her at the time, to make sure I'd be protected when the moment came. I hadn't known, when I called Patricia in October, that the codicil existed. I'd called her to review the estate documents, to make sure everything was in order before what I'd expected to be a difficult winter. She'd told me about the codicil in that first call, reading the relevant section aloud in her careful, unhurried voice, and I'd sat in the car in the parking structure off Colfax for several minutes after she finished, not moving, just holding the phone. My wife had known. She'd done it quietly, without telling me, without making it a conversation or a declaration. She'd just done it. That was the thing about her. She was always working on problems I hadn't noticed yet. Us. The letter from Claire arrived on a Wednesday in late January, 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. A real letter, handwritten, in an envelope with a stamp. I recognized her handwriting from the return address before I opened it. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she had spent weeks thinking about what had happened, about what she'd said at the table on Thanksgiving, about the years before that, the assumptions she'd made, the ways she'd let Marcus's certainty about what they were owed become her own certainty, the way she'd stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to be managed. She wrote that she understood if I couldn't forgive her, and that she wasn't writing to ask for anything. She wrote that she hoped, eventually, we could find our way back to something. It was a good letter. She'd meant it. I could tell that from the handwriting alone, the way it changed pressure in the middle of sentences, the places where she'd clearly stopped and started again. I read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window the way it did in January, low and pale and particular to that season. Then I set it on the table and left it there. I didn't write back. Not that day, not in the weeks that followed. There was nothing dishonest in that. Some things needed to sit before they could be answered, and I'd learned, over 68 years, that the answers that came quickly were rarely the ones worth giving. The silence wasn't punishment. It was consideration. There was a difference. And it was the same difference I'd tried to explain to Marcus in that conference room, the one between needing and wanting, between what you have to have and what you've simply decided you deserve. My wife had understood that difference better than anyone I'd ever known. She'd built it into a legal document and filed it with an attorney she trusted, and she'd done it without telling me, because she'd known I would have told her it wasn't necessary, and she'd known I would have been wrong. On a Thursday evening in February, I sat in the living room with the lights off and the streetlights coming through the front window, the way they'd come through since we'd moved in 31 years ago. The neighborhood had changed around the house, but the angle of the light through that window had stayed the same. Some things hold. Through the doorway, on the kitchen counter, the green recipe box sat where it had always sat, the rooster on the lid catching the light from the street. I'd opened it once, a few months after Ruth died, found her handwriting on 3 dozen index cards, and closed it again. Some things you don't need to disturb, some things you just need to know are still there. I picked up my coffee cup from the side table. It was still warm. I drank it slowly, looking at the room, the bookshelves Ruth had picked out, the rug we'd argued about, and then both come to love, her photograph on the windowsill where she was laughing at something off to the left of the frame, something I'd never been able to remember no matter how many times I looked. She had protected me. She'd done it the only way she could, in the only window she'd had. And she'd done it well. I set the cup down. Outside, the streetlights held steady against the February dark. That was enough. He brought coffee from the place on Larimer he knew I liked, the one with the blue awning that had been there since the 90s. And we sat at the kitchen table the way we'd been sitting at kitchen tables together since he was old enough to reach the surface. He was quieter than usual. He'd been at the meeting he'd watched Claire's face when Patricia read the codicil, had watched Marcus stand up too quickly and knock his chair back, had been in the room for all of it. He hadn't called me in the days since, which I'd understood. He was processing. He'd always needed time to process. After a while, he said, "You did the right thing, Dad." I turned the coffee cup in my hands. "I did what your mother wanted me to do," I said. That's all it was. He looked at me for a moment, then looked down at the table. There was a photograph on the windowsill behind him, one I'd put there years ago, a picture of my wife taken on the back porch of the Elmwood house in the summer of 1998. She was laughing at something off to the left of the frame, something I couldn't see, something I'd never been able to remember no matter how many times I looked at the picture. She looked the way she always looked when she was entirely herself, not performing anything for anyone, just present, just real. I looked at it for a long time. James didn't say anything else about it. We talked about other things, his work, a project he had coming up in the spring, whether the Broncos had any reasonable hope for the back half of the season. Normal things. The kind of conversation that doesn't need to carry weight to be worth having. When he left, he hugged me at the door, which he didn't always do. I told him to drive carefully. He said he would. The letter from Claire arrived on a Wednesday in late January, 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. A real letter, handwritten, in an envelope with a stamp. I recognized her handwriting from the return address before I opened it. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she had spent weeks thinking about what had happened, about what she'd said at the table on Thanksgiving, about the years before that, the assumptions she'd made, the ways she'd let Marcus's certainty about what they were owed become her own certainty, the way she'd stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to be managed. She wrote that she understood if I couldn't forgive her, and that she wasn't writing to ask for anything. She wrote that she hoped, eventually, we could find our way back to something. It was a good letter. She'd meant it. I could tell that from the handwriting alone, the way it changed pressure in the middle of sentences, the places where she'd clearly stopped and started again. I read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window the way it did in January, low and pale and particular to that season. Then I set it on the table and left it there. I didn't write back. Not that day. Not in the weeks that followed. There was nothing dishonest in that. Some things needed to sit before they could be answered, and I'd learned, over 68 years, that the answers that came quickly were rarely the ones worth giving. The silence wasn't punishment. It was consideration. There was a difference, and it was the same difference I'd tried to explain to Marcus on the phone, the one between needing and wanting, between what you have to have and what you've simply decided you deserve. My wife had understood that difference better than anyone I'd ever known. She'd built it into a legal document and filed it with an attorney she trusted, and she'd done it without telling me because she'd known I would have told her it wasn't necessary, and she'd known I would have been wrong. On a Thursday evening in February, I sat in the living room of the Elmwood house with the lights off and the streetlights coming through the front window, the way they'd come through since we'd moved in 31 years ago. The neighborhood had changed around the house. The Petersons' place had been torn down and rebuilt twice. The elm trees along the parkway were younger than the ones I remembered, but the angle of the light through that window had stayed the same. Some things hold. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, which was what she always did. I said, "I wanted to thank you for keeping everything safe, for handling it the way you handled it." There was a brief pause on her end. "Your wife was very clear about what she wanted," Patricia said. "She was clear about you, specifically. She said she knew you'd do the right thing when the time came." I looked at the photograph on the windowsill, the same one from the porch, the one where she was laughing at something I couldn't see. "She always knew," I said. Patricia said goodnight. I set the phone on the arm of the chair. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they've been lived in long enough to absorb the sound of everything that's happened inside them. 31 years of dinners and arguments and ordinary Tuesday evenings and one particular December morning that I didn't think about directly if I could help it. The house held all of it. It had always held all of it. I picked up the coffee cup from the side table. It was still warm. I drank it slowly, looking at the room, the bookshelves my wife had picked out, the rug we'd argued about and then both come to love, the green recipe box still on the kitchen counter through the doorway, the rooster on the lid catching the light from the street. I hadn't won anything. That wasn't the right word for it. What I had was what my wife had made sure I would have: the house, the quiet, the time to sit in it without anyone else's claim pressing against the walls. She had protected me. She'd done it the only way she could, in the only window she'd had, and she'd done it well. I set the cup down. Outside, the streetlights held steady against the February dark, the same as they'd always been, the same as they would be tomorrow. That was enough. If you've ever sat in a room that holds 30 years of living the arguments, the ordinary evenings, The one morning you don't let yourself think about directly. You already understand why some things can't be measured in what was won or lost, only in what was protected and what remains. I'll keep telling these stories, if they find something true in you.